I have read hundreds of books on business. But these 5 books are the exact books to read for every level of business, taking you from being a first-time founder with no idea to building a multi-million-pound empire. And I know this because these are the exact books I used when I went from living on a council estate in South London to selling a business for multiple 8 figures at 27 and having a 47 million a year private equity portfolio. See, these books cover everything from how to actually get started when you have nothing, the best way to print customers consistently, to what truly scales you into a multi-million-pound business and what to do once you get there. Now, the first book to read is all about the right idea because, bro, if you don't have a good idea, then you're not going to be successful. That's just the truth. But rather than just waiting for the idea to hit you in a dream, what if you could actually create good ideas on demand? And that's what this first book is about. And it's called How to Be a Founder. So it's written by 2 people, Matthew Clifford and Alice Becknick. They founded a company called Entrepreneur First, which has funded a ton of billion-dollar businesses. So they know what it takes to build a great idea. Now, the biggest takeaway from this book is identifying something called your founder's edge. Now, what's your founder's edge? Your founder's edge is basically what makes you uniquely placed to start this business. For example, with my company, Fanbytes, right? One reason why we won was because we were young people helping brands to market to young people on social media. And so that made it easier to get customers, that made it easier to raise money. And this book goes into how you can identify your edge and then leverage it. You know, this idea of founder's edge is one reason why I say it's generally a bad idea for founders to start businesses that they have no experience in, because then you don't have a founder's edge. Reading this book will take you from, I think this is a good idea, to I know this is a good idea. And once you've got that, then you move on to the next stage, which is getting customers, which brings us on to the next book, which is this book, this lovely light blue book. So now you've got a banging idea and now it's about getting customers. Now this book I'm going to show you was the secret to Fanbytes making 400K in his first year, $1 million in his second year, and 2.1 million in his third year. Now, true story. When we were running Fanbytes, we were scampering about trying to hustle, and I read this book and it just made things so predictable. And that book is Traction by Gabriel Weinberg and Justin Mayers. Now, the major takeaway from this book is basically how to test customer acquisition channels and then double down on what's worked. So when I was running Fanbytes, we were doing the same thing everyone was doing, which was cold emailing, LinkedIn DMing. And then I read this book and it basically gave me 12 different channels to test with and then double down on what worked. And we took one of the channels, which was events and conferences. And we decided to test that, where I'd go to events and conferences, talk about the power of influencer marketing. And that was the major unlock, because me speaking there meant a ton of people came to want to work with Fanbytes. And we then made $1 million in our second year and 2.1 million in our third year, all by using the principles from this book. So if you are someone who is thinking, how do I get customers? How do I test out different channels? How do I know what's worked? This book, whether you're B2C or B2B, is the book for you. All right, so we've talked about finding a good idea. We've talked about getting customers. So now we're on to scaling. And this brings me to this very, very weird book. And it reads like a workbook, but it's one of the best books, the most underrated books. So early on in my business career, when I mentioned our first year we got to 400K, it was a bit of a mishmash. We had people like Charlotte Tilbury, we had people like Go Ape, we had a bunch of random clients. And we couldn't scale because everyone was different, until one investor told me about this book and I read it and boom, we just scaled so predictably. That's why we got to multi-8 figures in our 5th year. And that book is a very weird book called Disciplined Entrepreneurship. Now, the author, Uncle Bill here, Uncle Bill has raised 100 million and sold multiple companies for billions of dollars. And one of the gems he talks about is finding a beachhead market. Now, the beachhead market is basically a customer set who has the need, the income, and enough people in the market for you to build a big business. So let me give you a good example of this, right? So Fanbytes, remember in our first year, we were just in a bit of a mishmash. We had so many different customers. But then, using the principles from this book about identifying a beachhead market, we identified that mobile apps were actually a set of customers that we could really build a big business on, because they constantly needed to advertise, they constantly needed creatives, and that's where influencer marketing came. And so we just settled on that for the second year, and instantly people like King, people like Yahoo, people like Miniclip, all these big brands were coming to us because we identified the beachhead using this exact same principles. So if you are someone who's basically got a whole range of different niche customers and you're thinking, how do I scale inside of those customers? Or how do I use those customers to get more customers? This book, yes, I know it reads like a textbook, but it's an absolute golden Bible for you to use. So we've talked about how to find the right idea. We've talked about how to get customers. And then we also talked about how to scale. Now, the most important thing to build a big business is the people. And this brings me on to a book I think every entrepreneur should read about hiring and who to hire, which is This book. Now, true story. When I was running Fanbytes, and the reason why I've been able to build a portfolio of companies which make 47 million a year is solely because of this book. Now, when you're an entrepreneur, what you tend to think is that you need to be the one who comes up with the answers to all the problems. But this book basically shows you how to hire people and why asking yourself who rather than how is the best way to grow your business. And it brings me on to Who, Not How by Dan Sullivan and Ben Hardy. So one of the major breakthroughs from this book is understanding that anytime you have a problem, rather than saying, how do we solve it? You ask yourself, who has solved the problem? And I'll give you a very real example of this, right? During Fanbytes, I was the person who was leading the sales team, and I was driving the sales team up until around 30, 40 people. And I actually didn't really like it. But in my mind, I just thought, well, I'm the CEO, I'm the commercial person, so I should lead them. Until I realized, hang on a sec, maybe I'm not doing that great a job. And maybe I should lower my ego to say who has already built and scaled a sales team, and then how do I bring them in? How do I incentivize them? How do I find them so that they can then do that? And eventually I brought in a sales director and they quadrupled revenue in a single year, all because of this book. All because this book forced me to ask myself, who has done the job? How do I find them? How do I incentivize them? And then as a result, how does my company grow? If you are someone who is stuck in the weeds of your business, you should read this book, you should implement it, and I promise you, Habibi, I promise you, your business will be a better business. How to come up with a great idea. We've gone through how to get customers. We've gone through how to scale your business, and we've also gone through how to hire people and who to hire. But this brings me on to the final book, because all of these helped me to get to 10 million a year by year 4 for my business Fanbyte. But the book that helped me eventually sell the business for multi-8 figures is a book called Built to Sell. Now, if you have followed me on social, you will see that I constantly talk about this book because this book changed my life. The biggest breakthrough from it was understanding that you can actually design your business to sell. It goes through the story of an agency owner who wanted to sell his business and the decisions and the paths that they took. And I just did the exact same thing. So it tells you what buyers look for, like repeatable revenue, client retention, management teams, and then it tells you how to do it. And actually, when we sold the business, I emailed the author and I said, thank you for writing this book because this book changed my life.